Since 1900, the United States of America has been entering more and more wars. One of these wars was known as the Korean War, which was the so-called first fight against communism. Now, we're going to take a look today at a video by PragerU explaining the reasons behind why America really joined the war in Korea. Needless to say, PragerU doesn't do the best job.
Mention the Korean War today and most people will look at you with a blank stare. At the time it was fought, just 5 years after World War II ended, everyone recognized it as a world-shaping conflict, a stark confrontation between the forces of democracy and communism.
Because it's entirely fair to compare a political idea like democracy against an economic idea like communism. This is a problem I do have with how the Cold War is taught, that we take democracy versus communism. This doesn't actually illustrate how the Cold War really was. Many times the United States, like in South Korea and South Vietnam, supported anti-communist dictatorships, not democracies. Really, the Cold War was just a fight for influence between the United States and the USSR. Sure, they claimed that ideology was behind it all, and it was, oh, we're gonna, force democracy, or we're gonna stall communism. No, it was just who would be the dominant power. There's no reason to compare these two, other than to create a fear-mongering idea of what communism really is.
Began on June 25, 1950, when Soviet-backed communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded its U.S.-backed anti-communist South Korean neighbor,
who, as we've established before, was not a democracy.
Within weeks, the communists had nearly absorbed the entire country. The United States at first was confused over whether it should or even could respond. America had slashed its military budget after the end of World War II and was short both men and equipment. It still had not awakened fully to the expansionist threat of Soviet Russia.
Now, by expansionist, I'm assuming you're meaning the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which wasn't really expansionist. The Soviet Union, yes, did have major influence over these countries, especially smaller ones, but the reason why the Warsaw Pact and many of the expansionist, quote-unquote, policies of the Soviet Union was to create a buffer zone between, well, in the Warsaw Pact's case, Germany and the Soviet Union, because Joseph Stalin did not trust the West to not try and invade through Germany after the Second World War. And if you remember Operation Unthinkable, this was not a completely paranoid assertion. It was very well a real threat. Now, that's to say, I'm not a Soviet apologist. I'm just saying that this quote-unquote expansionism by the Soviet Union isn't what they're trying to portray it as.
The Soviets, buoyed by their own recent development of an atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, sensed America's lack of resolve and encouraged the North's aggression. Yet within weeks, President Harry Truman rushed troops to save the shrinking Allied perimeter at Pusan on the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. By late September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had successfully completed the Incheon landings and launched counterattacks. He quickly reclaimed the entire South and sent American-led United Nations forces far into North Korea to reunite the entire peninsula, only to be surprised when hundreds of thousands of Chinese Red Army troops.
I'll admit this next point is kind of minor and petty, but in my opinion it goes to show just how little PragerU cares about actually portraying history correctly. The Chinese army was called the People's Liberation Army, not the Red Army. The Soviet Union's army, for a little while after World War II, so during this time period, would have still been called the Red Army, but China was the People's Liberation Army. It just boggles me how they're claiming to know everything about this conflict and why America was justified, and I cannot even get the name of China's army right. And if this is supposed to be a dig at China, saying, oh, the Reds, using a slur from the 1950s to prove why you're justified in going to war just shows how unbiased you are. No, it shows how biased you are against the ideas of communism and how you're inherently dismissing it as evil and something else.
Crossed the Yalu River at the Chinese border and sent the outnumbered Americans reeling back into South Korea. Thanks to the genius of General Matthew Ridgway, who arrived to assume supreme command in South Korea in December 1950, over the next 100 days, U.S.-led UN forces pushed the communists back across the 38th parallel. The fighting was fierce. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, exchanged hands between communist and U.S.-led forces 5 times before it was finally secured. During the years 1952 and 1953, the war grew static, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Eventually, the conflict ended with a tense armistice in July 1953. For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea.
All right, 2 things. First, Stalinism doesn't exist. It's typically used as a slur against Marxist-Leninism. And even if Stalinism does exist, North Korea wouldn't be considered Stalinist. It's a juche state. Second, sure, South Korea became the model of American-style democracy, but how did it get to there? What are you ignoring? Well, what he's ignoring is the complete, just utter madness of South Korean history, changing hands between dictatorships, shooting of protesters and students attempting to form what they thought was a true democracy, rather than the U.S.-backed dictatorship.
Over 35,000 Americans died in the Korean War. The war marked the first major armed conflict of the nuclear age, and one in which the United States had not clearly defeated the enemy and thus not dictated terms of surrender. Was fighting the Korean War and restoring the South without uniting the entire peninsula worth the huge cost in blood and treasure? The natural dividend of saving the South was the evolution of today's democratic and prosperous South Korea that has given its 50 million citizens undreamed of freedom and affluence, and has blessed the world with top-flight products from the likes of Hyundai, Kia, LG, and Samsung. South Korea is a model global citizen and a strong ally of the U.S., and stands in sharp contrast to the communist regime in the North.
North Korea is a juche state, like I said earlier. They've gotten rid of all mentions of communism or socialism from their country, because they would know that the people would overthrow the juche state to actually implement a socialist republic. You are using fear-mongering tactics again, which, remember, totally unbiased.
It has starved and murdered millions of its own people. And
don't make me bring this guy back up. Seriously, I don't want to. But if you make me, South Korea, on its global dream of trying to get American-style democracy, killed plenty of their own people. So why don't you talk about that?
Caused untold mischief in the world community. Had it not been for U.S. intervention and support to the South, the current monstrous regime in Pyongyang would now rule all of Korea, ensuring its nuclear-armed dictatorship even greater power and resources. The American effort to save South Korea also sent a message to both Communist China and the Soviet Union that the free world, under U.S. leadership,
because remember, the alienation from the fruits of your labor and basic economic slavery of American capitalism and corporatism is completely and utterly freedom.
Would no longer tolerate communist military takeovers of free nations.
Can you go 5 seconds without contradicting yourself from what historically happened. The United States has done plenty of military takeoverships of free nations. Not to mention secret and covert takeovers of free nations. Can you just stop contradicting yourself? Please.
Resulting deterrence policy helped to keep the communist world from attempting similar surprise attacks on Japan, Taiwan, and Western Europe.
Are you kidding me right now? Yugoslavia, which was one of the countries that you put in red, as you can see after this, was a socialist country. It was a socialist federation of Yugoslavia. Not to mention, Greece had a civil war. Italy was close to electing a Marxist. What are you... Stop historically contradicting yourselves and making maps that make no sense.
Finally, the Korean War.
He even stuck Albania in there as one of the countries that had fallen to the communist world. So how could you mess up Yugoslavia that badly?
Awakened the United States to the dangers of disarmament and isolationism.
What isolationism? The United States was helping to build back Europe, which was basically the equivalent of the creation of the Warsaw Pact. What isolationism are you talking about?
And led to the bipartisan foreign policy of containment of global communism that in 1989 finally led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It was 1991, you insufferable idiot.
And with it, victory in the Cold War. The Korean War was an incomplete American victory in its failure to liberate North Korea and unite the peninsula, but a victory nonetheless, and not just from a military perspective, but from a moral one as well.
Because allowing a man, and even supporting a man, who killed his own people to ensure his own power, and many other dictators, is completely moral.
The reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free.
No, the reason those Americans died was so that, one, you could keep this guy in power for a while longer, and two, so that, it wouldn't be under communism. And honestly, if South Korea had fallen to the North Koreans, we probably would have had an actual socialist rebellion in the country by now.
Korea did not have a single material resource that would have benefited America.
Except more markets to exploit, as well as more people to exploit from the fruits of their labor. But, those don't count.
The Korean War merits more than a blank stare. It deserves to be remembered and studied with pride.
Hip hip for imperialism, everybody. Whoa.
Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
So the video ends there with more just subscribe to us so we can keep producing more propaganda. Now, I will admit I am biased towards left-wing politics as I am a Marxist, but I've tried to be remotely objective in how I've interpreted my own arguments against this video. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more. Also, go check out my friend, the Marxist Viking, who inspired me to do this video, and he also has a video out disproving another PragerU video about the merits of capitalism. Thank you.